Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Rebecca Ward, and I'm pleased to be co-hosting today's webinar alongside Dr. Jane Harrison on infrastructure tipping points, climate adaptation for on-site wastewater systems in the coastal Carolinas. This is the third and final webinar in our fall 2023 series on climate health and equity, being brought to you by C3HE. We are the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate Health and Equity. We're a NOAA Climate Adaptation Partnership, one of 13 regional centers nationwide working alongside communities to foster climate resilience. We're a multi-institution collaborative based at NC State University, and our work centers on building community partnerships to advance climate resilience and health equity. We bring together insights from social science, physical science, and regional knowledge to collaboratively create solutions. And we also focus our efforts on frontline and at-risk populations, and in so doing, aim to support communities facing a higher exposure to climate hazards and other interconnected social challenges. We do a lot of really fantastic work in the Carolinas with really wonderful community partners. If you'd like to learn more about our program, we encourage you to visit our website, carolinascap.com, which is in the lower right of the screen, where you can find out more about our work, who is on our team, information about upcoming events and webinars as well. We're doing this fall webinar series because we wanted to kind of showcase some of the different types of work, flavors that we do, and people who we work with. So now I will turn things over to Jane to introduce today's topic and our panelists and kick things off.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to share my screen when yours is out of there. Okay. All right. And if there's any issues as I'm sharing my screen, Rebecca, please let me know. Good to see you all this morning. My name is Jane Harrison. I work for North Carolina Sea Grant. We are a NOAA-based program at NC State. And I have the pleasure of just kicking off this conversation today about climate change adaptation for on-site wastewater treatment systems in the coastal Carolinas. I worked with an interdisciplinary team over the last few years, working side by side, some of our partners in the coastal Carolinas, the town of Nags Head, the city of Folly Beach in South Carolina. And we're excited to share the results of that work. And we are also joined today by Leslie Leonard from the South Carolina Environmental Law Project. So you're going to hear from some of our research team first, not, I guess, in the order that's listed here, but you will hear from Dr. Jared Bowden, Dr. Humphrey, and Dr. O'Driscoll. In our work, it was very interdisciplinary, so you can see the types of expertise that we had, and I will share some of our links to different research products as well during the webinar so that you can follow up. And again, we're just so thankful to have been working side by side, the town of Nags Head and city of Folly Beach, as they're thinking about adaptation from a very practical standpoint. We are trying to provide research that can be used by communities that are impacted by changes in our coastal areas. So just what was our work about? We really focused on septic systems and on-site wastewater treatment in the coastal areas of our two states, North and South Carolina. And our concern is that their functionality is at risk due to both climate change and current weather trends. Not to mention just the general wear and tear of these systems when they're not maintained properly. And so when they're not working, what happens is, there's impaired functionality, inability to process contaminants. And this is of special concern to areas that do not have access to centralized wastewater treatment, particularly rural areas and small towns, many of our coastal areas in both states. So just in case anyone's a little shaky on what does a septic system look like, you can see from a private residence here, solids from your toilet, your wastewater is going to go first into a tank underneath the ground. So all of this brown is your soil treatment area. It's going to then hit the drain field, and then it is eventually going to reach your groundwater. So it's very important that you have sufficient soil treatment area under the drain field And we refer to this area as the separation distance. So the vertical separation distance between the drain field and your groundwater is where that contamination or the contaminants are going to be treated. And so with climate change, we see a few things happening, and you're going to hear much about that from Dr. Bowden. We see sea level rise, we see increased rainfall at times, and then ultimately changes in groundwater level that reduces that separation distance or treatment area available. So in my role in the research, I was working directly with Lauren Voorhees. She finished her master's at Duke, and we published a paper based on our research doing interviews with on-site system managers. So these are our installers, our operators of septic systems, cluster systems, as well as environmental regulators in both states. And so these are our takeaways, just very quickly. We did find that weather and climate are not accounted for in system site selection and determining permits. We also found that current regulations are inadequate to deal with future climate risks. Next, we were happy to see that there are some resilience measures being implemented regardless of regulations. So we're able to highlight some of those adaptations. And then finally, that truly we need adaptive capacity at every level increased, whether that's at the local municipal level, the household level, the state level. Education and communication with system owners is critical so that they can do the right thing. So I'm going to stop my share for now, and I believe Max has a poll question for us. Max is behind the scenes making this webinar happen. Just to get your all sense, I wonder if you could just answer question 1 for now. I don't know if you have to answer all 3 at the moment, but see if you can answer at least question 1. What is the top concern for how climate change impacts on-site wastewater treatment in the coastal Carolinas? And if you have to answer all 3 of these at once, do go ahead. The second question is, research studies indicate that vertical separation distance should be what for adequate soil treatment of wastewater? And then finally, question number 3, how can local communities help households maintain their septic systems? Max, are you able to show us the results? All right, I can see the results on my end. I'm hoping you all can too. If anyone's having trouble accessing those, please do put it in the chat. And if you have any questions during these presentations, do add it in the chat. So it looks like the majority of folks realize that the rising water table is a top concern for how climate change impacts on-site wastewater treatment. And then also it does seem like the majority believes that greater than 2 feet is needed for vertical separation distance, although there's plenty of folks that said no idea. And then finally, everyone got this one right. How can local communities help households maintain their septic systems? These are all possible opportunities, and I mentioned them because these are some of the elements that the town of Nags Head is working on. So they're really a great leader in this space. So at this time, I'm going to share my screen for Dr. Bowden's presentation. Let me pull that up.
Hey, Jane, I'll share my screen.
Oh, right. Okay, please do.
Okay. Sorry. So hopefully you can see that, Jane.
Looks good. Go ahead.
Great. So thank you. Today I'm going to talk about the future and thinking about climate change in the coastal Carolinas and in particular thinking about decentralized wastewater systems. And so the first thing that I think about is like what changes should we be most concerned about? And it's great that that Jane had that. I didn't know she was going to send out that those list of questions and poll people. But it is, I think, the big thing is thinking about the groundwater and the groundwater depth and evaporation in particular is a very important control of groundwater, as well as other things like sea level rise. And so I want to talk about particular when we're thinking about groundwater. What problems do we need to think about when thinking about Eastern North Carolina? And so the first big thing is sea level rise and is probably especially for those within near proximity to the coast. And if you're looking, this is a recent plot from the Fifth National Climate Assessment, which was just released a few weeks ago, and it's just showing the average trend since the 90s in terms of sea level rise per decade, and you'll really see that eastern seaboard is a hot spot of relative change in sea level rise, and that's an extreme concern for our coastal communities because we know that we've observed high rates of change of sea level within these areas. So specifically, I took a look and here there's a tool that NOAA has that allows you to look at sea level rise. But in this case, what we tried to do was relate different scenarios to the amount of global warming you may anticipate by end of century. And so there's this intermediate low, an intermediate, a high, and a intermediate high and a high. And if you were to say where are we probably heading, it's probably in between somewhere around the intermediate to intermediate high is kind of where the consensus in the science is. But if you were to think about how much sea level rise you would anticipate, when would 1 foot of sea level rise occur? And even with the intermediate low some scenario, that occurs within the next few decades. So 1 additional feet of sea level rise is expected at some point within the next few decades. Now, if you're thinking about towards the higher end and maybe towards like being very, very resilient, thinking about 3 feet of sea level rise, when will that occur? Even with the intermediate low and the intermediate scenarios, you're approaching that by end of century. And so remember that intermediate scenario is kind of like that place where we're thinking about is very likely to be. And so you're looking even at mid-century possibility around 2050, 2060, around 2 feet of sea level rise, upwards of 3 feet by end of century. So there's other things about sea level, but beyond sea level rise that are important when you're thinking about septic systems, in particular, changes in precipitation impact the groundwater levels, as well as how much evaporation you have. As I showed previously, there's strong seasonality in the groundwater, and so depth. And in particular, in the summertime, the groundwater levels from the surface are much deeper, just simply because the evaporation demand is much greater and the amount of evaporation that happens in the summer. But here we're looking at the mean state of the climate and what will happen. And one thing that's pretty clear from a lot of models that project out towards here, let's say towards the end of century, that during the winter time in particular, there's an increase. And in general, across much of Eastern North Carolina, this is Dare, North Carolina example, is just that there's an increase, but the uncertainty grows for the summertime in particular in terms of what will happen. And then as you go to higher and higher emission scenarios, the likelihood of becoming drier increases. But the big thing is when you're thinking about this is really the evaporation deficit. And what this is simply you're looking at potential evapotranspiration. So if you were able to take a surface of water and evaporate all the water away with a given temperature, how much happens versus Actually what gets evaporated is, for instance, soils dry out. You're not just a water body. And so what could potentially happen in the future if you take this difference and you're looking at evaporation deficit? The thing is that the evaporation deficit is really a problem in the summertime, but that doesn't mean a problem for groundwater, right? Because you're potentially increasing the evaporation even more than what you have historically, and so the groundwater levels would be lower. So where's the problem at? It's really probably the transition seasons and the winter seasons when you might have a lot of problems with groundwater just simply based on rainfall and evaporation properties and how they may change in the future. There's another issue, and I don't know if Mike's going to show some of this, but the groundwater levels will peak very rapidly during intense rainfall events, and so there'll be this intermediate or basically this time when you'll have this extreme rainfall, and then your septic system isn't functioning as you would anticipate, just simply because the groundwater levels are much higher or closer to the surface. But if you look at the how rainfall statistics may change in the future, we have a concern that the intensity and the frequency of rainfall will change. And this is just looking at daily rainfall amounts at end century for a very high emission scenario. And what it's showing you here is that these are different return periods. And so people talk about a 10-year storm, a 100-year storm. This is basically related to annual exceedance probabilities and saying like a 100-year event is how much rainfall. And there's a lot of things that are designed related to this, and kind of many things about stormwater and highway infrastructure is related to this. But if you're taking a look at what's projected to happen, for instance, a 25-year storm, today it'll be like in the future a 10-year storm. And so that's what the um the 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 statistics show from the climate model data that's available, especially as you get to higher and higher emission scenarios, that these intensity and frequency, these rainfall events will become more problematic for septic systems because of groundwater rise. And then there was in the poll also talked about hurricanes. Hurricanes are, just events that happen on occasion, and typically in North Carolina we get an event about the return period of a hurricane is about every basically every 3 years. And we haven't really had that. We haven't had a big storm in recent years, but if you're looking at the changes in precipitation totals, we did these experiments that looked at idealized hurricanes in a warmer climate, and some of our big hurricanes within eastern North Carolina, including Matthew, Florence, and Floyd. And then we basically could simulate these same events in a warmer climate and see how much rainfall falls from these storms. And it's very significant. You're looking upwards of 40 to 50% increases in precipitation totals. And not only is the precipitation totals increasing at a location, but also the spatial extent of the precipitation is increasing. So you're having that's another problem that I think is a much bigger problem that Eastern North Carolina has to think about, and that's the big flooding events and what they mean for um, on-site wastewater treatment systems. So just to conclude, on-site wastewater treatment will directly be impacted by sea level rise. And in particular, thinking about end of century, you're looking at 3 feet for even a lower emission scenario. The lower bound is around 2.6 feet, with a possibly of 2 feet by mid-century for higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios. Um, there'll be changes in the mean state anticipated for the Carolinas for rainfall in particular and evaporation potential. And so mean changes in rainfall will likely create additional problems, I think, especially in the winter when precipitation increases with minor changes in evaporation deficits. And then finally, I think the acute rainfall events, these are going to be the cause acute failures across the state. And they'll be more frequent and more severe than what we've seen historically. And for instance, the precipitation intensity and frequency anticipated to increase, like the 25-year event, becomes like a 10-year event in the future. And then I think we have to be really concerned about hurricanes. We live along a place where basically Eastern North Carolina kind of juts out into the ocean, the Outer Banks, and it's a place where there's been a lot of hurricanes hit historically, and I think we have to think about what that means for these septic systems, especially rainfall intensity, and that these systems may be operating for many, many months at times when these systems hit, not function as what we would anticipate. So I'll leave it there, Jane, and turn it back over to you.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to pull up Dr. Driscoll's presentation. And again, if anyone has questions or thoughts, please do put them in the chat as we go along, and we'll discuss those at the end. Mike, you're up.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, you can toggle through there. Good morning, everyone. Excited to talk about septic systems right before lunch, so hopefully we don't ruin your appetite. This is a slide that Jane kind of started with, and really perfect to kind of show what we've seen. We'll focus a little bit on Dare County, but the fact that with rising sea level, the groundwater levels are rising, and because the water table isn't very deep there, just a foot or two makes a big difference in septic system functionality. So we'll try to wrap up with a little bit of ideas on some of the adaptation approaches. So next slide, please. So looking at the way that most residences in Dare County would treat their wastewater using a conventional septic system. And of course, there's some other advanced systems too that are starting to come into play now. But the main point is the state for sandy soils, they ask for 45 centimeters or 1.5 feet of vertical separation distance. So you want to have that unsaturated soil underneath the drain field to help to treat some of the bacteria and viruses, and also for nutrient conversion and treatment. Some of the field and column studies suggest it's really a lot better to have over 2 feet if that's possible. That's not what we have, but we use 1.5 feet for the sandy soils. And if you can toggle to the next, please, Jane. And so basically the dry soil is helping to filter the wastewater. Next, please. And near the coast, the challenge is just that the water table is going to be shallow. And so if this is changing over time, it can start to threaten these systems. If you can toggle next, please, Jane. And so this is kind of what happens over time. We start to lose the unsaturated soils underneath the system, and it can reduce some of the treatment capacity. Next, please. So it's great that Jared talked a little bit about the broader sea level rise that we have been measuring at the coast of North Carolina and up and down the East Coast. And generally our northern part of our coast and the southern part of Virginia, they've been experiencing some of the fastest sea level rise rates in the country. So this is a hot spot where we're going to notice some differences. NOAA's been measuring this at Duck, North Carolina, and they estimate right now about 4.7 millimeters per year of sea level rise. As Jared mentioned, about a meter rise is expected by 2100. So next slide, please, Jane. And so for this project, we looked at some long-term wells in Dare County. These are DEQ wells, and they have a good network set up. You can see with the orange squares, those would be where there's some long-term wells. And then we also added 5 new wells around the area adjacent to septic systems to be able to monitor these. And Charlie's going to talk about this a little bit next. But what we can notice is if you look at the average groundwater depth conditions over time, there's a trend where the groundwater is getting shallower over time, and it relates pretty well to that sea level rise curve that we looked at earlier. So the groundwater is getting closer to the surface, and so this is starting to cause problems for the on-site wastewater treatment. Next slide, please. And here's an example of what that looks like for an individual well. This is at Wanchese Community Center. And so basically, typically the septic system drain field will be buried at about a 1/2 meter depth. And so if you consider the 45 centimeter vertical separation distance, we would really want the water table to be a meter or deeper for functional septic systems. And so I kind of shaded that in blue, where when the groundwater is in those levels closer to a meter to the surface, it starts to be unsuitable conditions for on-site wastewater treatment for conventional septic systems. So you can see back in the 80s, there were times when the water table was deeper, but as you get to the most recent 2 decades, most of the time the groundwater is within a meter of the surface, and sometimes it's even rising up to the surface. So this would indicate that it's making it more difficult for the unsaturated soils to be available for wastewater treatment from septic systems. Next slide, please. So this is an example. There was a community member in South Nags Head, and you can see Charlie there. She actually volunteered for us to monitor the groundwater levels near her system. And this is a site that's about 5 feet above sea level. So it's a pretty low-lying area down in South Nags Head. And if you could toggle to the next, please, Jane. So when we lifted up the cap, so this is appetizing right before lunch, sorry about that. We could see the inlet pipe coming from the home. You can see how that's inundated, right? That's supposed to be gravity drain. There's supposed to be some space there between the wastewater in the tank and the inlet pipe. And what this told us is basically this system is being flooded by groundwater. Next slide, please. So monitoring data at this site, we could see if you look in the blue line is showing the groundwater depth since we started monitoring there. And the dashed line at the top that's labeled drain field is the depth where the drain field lines are. And so when the groundwater levels are higher than that, that's showing that that system is being inundated by groundwater in blue. So that's kind of the current situation. When we use the groundwater level trends that we've observed, we could see that by 2040, if you project this forward, that would indicate that the wastewater would start upwelling to the surface during storms like Jared had mentioned. So over time, it's starting to make these systems that may have been permitted properly back in the 80s to lose their functionality. So next slide, please. And one screening tool, as Jared mentioned, the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, I just point out here that location of that particular site. And this would be projecting forward to 2100. And those areas that are inundated by 2100, those will be sites that are likely also experiencing groundwater inundation of their septic systems right now. So this tool may be helpful to kind of screen and understand sites that are currently vulnerable. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of the situation at that residence and some of the residences nearby, is that the groundwater's risen up into the drain field and the unsaturated soils have shrunk, and so their capacity to treat has been diminished. Next slide, please. And this situation, it's been observed up and down the Atlantic coast from Rhode Island down to Miami. This particular figure here is from some of the work in Miami, where they show kind of over time when you have rising groundwater level, you go from systems that were functional when they were installed to compromised systems that don't have enough vertical separation distance for proper treatment, and then failing systems where the systems are actually being flooded by groundwater. Next slide, please. So some of the things we found in this study, a good screening tool is land surface elevation. This can tell you a lot about the approximate groundwater depth. And typically what we saw is when the land surface is below about 7.5 to 8 feet above sea level, it starts to be that the groundwater table is typically within a meter of the surface. And so that can help screen to understand areas that are very vulnerable. Alternative systems, there's some new advanced engineered systems and mound systems like I show in this figure here can be some possible adaptation approaches to help create conditions that are more suitable for wastewater treatment. Maintenance and reduced water use can also help with compromised systems. Most communities don't have a septic system database or monitoring on their systems, so more of this can be helpful to understand the linkages to human and environmental health. And then I think, as Jane started out with, the current regulations generally assume stable groundwater levels. And so in the future, in these areas where the groundwater is rising, I think we need to account for that in our regulations to adapt to this. Based on the trends that we saw, the risks of septic system failure in coastal areas will increase as groundwater levels rise with sea level. So thanks for your attention. I will pass it over to Charlie now.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mike. Charlie, I'm pulling up your presentation. Or were you going to do it? Apologies, I forgot.
Yeah, you can pull it up if you.
I'm pulling it up. Okay. And I did see the question in the chat. Someone was asking, how do you know if your system's failing? And, I think sometimes folks really don't know unless there is, a smell, an odor, something that you can actually see. It's not always obvious if you don't have regular maintenance going on. And I think if anyone else wants to add to the chat or answer that, please do.
Yeah, usually I show a slide, but you can see ponded waste in the drain field sometimes, or backing up into the home. Problems after rainfall can also be an indication.
All right, should I go ahead? Okay.
You're up, Charlie.
Thanks. So another aspect of this project was to get some water quality monitoring data. So we wanted to not just compare or determine how efficient the septic systems were at treating common pollutants like nitrogen, phosphorus, and bacteria, but we also wanted to look at, well, what are the alternatives? Things like centralized sewer or package plants. How effective are they? So then in making long-term decisions, that will give us a little more information. Okay, next slide. So just a quick review. So for septic systems or on-site wastewater systems, most of the ones that are in use are gravity flow. They have a septic tank, drain-filled trenches, and the soil. The tank just separates the solids and the liquids. The solids will remain in the tank. The liquid effluent leaves the tank, goes into the drain-filled trenches where it's stored until it can infiltrate into the soil. So most of the processing, the treatment of pollutants and various contaminants should occur in the soil beneath the trenches, as Mike was mentioning. So it's very important that we have a certain amount of aerated soil below the trenches for that processing. The thing is, once the system's installed, there's not really any follow-up in most instances to see if it's functioning or not. The question just a minute ago was, how do you know if it's working properly? A follow-up question to that would be, what do you define as working properly? If the obvious signs would be if effluent comes to the surface, wastewater is not infiltrating, it's not being treated, or if it's backing up in the home. But in instances where groundwater is too close to the drain-filled trenches, there's no real way of knowing that unless you have groundwater monitoring wells, near those trenches. And so that's really what's lacking. There have been some studies that we've worked on, other researchers, where we kind of looked at what's in groundwater near these systems and compared it to the wastewater in the tank, and kind of looked at those differences. But, you think about the millions of septic systems that are along the coastal areas, there's, is that a representative sample that's available now? So more information is needed. Part of this study, we wanted to gather more information on how coastal septic systems are working, but then also compare them again to the alternatives. The way we decided upon the alternatives were municipal sewer systems, where the wastewater from a community is piped to one central location. There it's treated, discharged, and if it's discharged to a surface water, they have to sample the influent and the effluent. And so for those systems, we do have some data on how effective they are. For the sites that discharge treated effluent to land, like there are some that use spray irrigation, there's less information. But again, those are the alternatives, so we wanted to see how the septic systems compared to those. If it's under 500,000 gallons per day, we're calling those package plants. And sometimes they have the same components as like the larger scale municipal sewer plants. It's just they don't treat as much flow. And as Mike mentioned, there are individual septic systems that sort of look like package plants, but they're even smaller scale. So again, we defined, on-site as septic systems, in someone's yard, package plants as treating less than 500,000 gallons per day, and sewer greater than 500,000 gallons per day. Next slide. So we were able to find volunteered sites that had septic systems and these package and sewer plants across eastern North Carolina and also in South Carolina. These are just some locations from where we had volunteers that allowed us to monitor their systems and the treatment plants. Next slide. So to gather the information on how effective the septic systems were, we had to install, again, the monitoring wells near the drain field trenches. And these are just some pictures showing the installation process where we're augering through the soil, kind of looking at the soil properties as they come out, installing the monitoring wells near the drain field trenches or between trenches. We had 8 sites altogether that we monitored during this study. 5 were brand new sites we had no data on that we instrumented. And then we used 3 of our existing sites that we had longer term data on. But from these sites, again, what we would do is collect wastewater samples from the septic tank, and then we'd collect groundwater samples near the drain field trenches, and we look at things like nitrogen, phosphorus, bacteria, how are those differences. And prior to collecting the samples of groundwater, we would take a depth of water. So then we knew how deep it was to groundwater, and we also knew how deep the trenches were, so we could determine that vertical separation. Next slide. So this is, again, some more pictures showing collecting a wastewater sample there on the left, and then collecting groundwater sample on the right. And we were able to go out to each site between 8 and 10 times to, again, collect samples, look at physical, chemical parameters that were in the wastewater and in the groundwater, and make those comparisons. Next slide. For the sewer plants and the package plants, it was a lot easier to collect the data. We didn't have to install wells. So we would collect an influent sample, we would collect an effluent sample, and we would compare those two. And, during the same months that we sampled the septic systems, we also sampled the sewer and the package plants. And so there's, again, sampled the same time during the year and the same number of samples. Next slide. These are just some of the characteristics of the individual sites that we monitored. We had a variety of septic system technologies that we studied, and we had 2 large sewer systems that we evaluated, and then 3 package plants. And that's just some of the characteristics of those sites. Next slide. So on to the results, and what I'll show today is just the concentration reductions. This is total dissolved nitrogen treatment efficiency is what we're seeing. Overall, there was a pretty wide range of efficiencies for the septic systems, the package plants. The sewer plants were a little more, I would say a little more even in terms of how they were performing. The septic systems, there was a range from 0% reduction to 95%. The 0% was the site that Mike was showing where groundwater was in the tank. If groundwater is in the tank and there's no separation, then wastewater is directly mixing with groundwater, and we can't really say there was any treatment. But for all the other locations, there was separation distance, and we did see some reductions in the concentrations. The average overall, even including the 0 for those, was about 63% concentration reduction of nitrogen for septic systems. For the package plants, they range from 23 to about 80%, with an average of about 47% reduction. And the sewer plants were on average about 84. I will point out for the package plants, the one that performed the poorest, where it says 23.5%, that site actually land applies the treated effluent. So there is some additional processing that we didn't sample groundwater at the site. They didn't have wells there, and we didn't install wells there. So that just wanted to point that out. There should be some additional processing before that wastewater actually reaches a natural water body. Next slide. For phosphorus, again, also a range of treatment efficiencies. For the septic systems, we had the 0 where there was no separation, again, in wastewater in the septic tank and in the trenches. But for all the others, the efficiency was really good. It was over 79% for all the others. Some approached almost 100% removal of phosphorus. The package plants, again, there was some variability there. There was one that what was in the influent was in the effluent. There was no reduction. And for that particular location, they didn't have to monitor for phosphorus. They monitored for nitrogen, but they didn't have to monitor for phosphorus. And so for sewer plants and package plants that do monitor for that, sometimes they'll add a chemical that will precipitate phosphorus out. That one wasn't required to do that, but that could be something that's looked at in the future if they wanted to improve their efficiency. For the sewer plants, their average was about 77%, so just under what the average septic system efficiency was. Next slide. And then for the bacteria concentration reductions, pretty much every site that we evaluated, again, other than the one that had wastewater or groundwater in the wastewater system in the tank, most of those were very efficient at lowering the concentrations of E. coli, is what we used as the fecal bacteria indicator. The average and the medians were typically under 3 or 4, most probable number of E. coli per 100 mils. And if you consider you start out in the millions, or hundreds of thousands, and you get down to under 5, that's really pretty good. So most of those systems that we evaluated, the septic, sewer, and package plant, we're doing a pretty good job with, lowering the E. coli concentrations. Next slide. So just to summarize, again, comparing these different options and technologies, the centralized sewer systems were the most efficient at removing nitrogen. The septic systems were the most efficient overall at lowering the phosphorus concentrations. All the technologies were pretty efficient at lowering the bacteria concentrations. But again, going back to the septic systems, which is kind of the focus of the study, the separation distance is so important for that treatment. And like Mike was saying, and like I'm just discussing now, we don't really monitor groundwater levels near systems. That's not a part of the permitting process. And as sea level rise, increases and separation distance decreases, that can really cause problems for the efficiency, which we may not be able to look at on site, determine without actual groundwater data. So just some things to consider.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to turn it over to the town of Nags Head. I do want to note there are a number of folks out here that are in the management realm in this topic. So if there's anything that's coming up that you're thinking about as we're all chatting, please just let us know. Anything that you're seeing out there that's either perhaps different or just interesting to note. I'm bringing up your slides, Connor. Give me a moment. All right, here you go.
All right. Morning. I'm Connor Twitty. I'm the environmental planner with the town of Nags Head. I run our septic health initiative program. And I guess we can go ahead and get started on some of this. I guess we can go ahead, just for time's sake, we'll kind of get into what the program has to offer. If we keep going just a little bit more. Yeah, we'll just keep going. Some stuff that we did in the past. We've done direct mailers through our DWMP, the Decentralized Wastewater Management Plan. It kind of highlighted the different wells and other areas that we wanted to expand to get different groundwater monitoring logs. We got 15 groundwater level monitors and 2 water quality monitors that are going to be installed within the next month. Just a quick update on that part right there. We can just keep on rolling through if you want. I know we're a little tight on time. So what our program for the town entails is we offer a free septic inspection, an annual inspection. We help locate tanks. If your tank has a filter, we will come out there and clean it, either myself or I do have 2 contractors that help do the inspections. If during the inspection, if we find the tank needs to be pumped, then we offer a $150 water bill credit that they can get the resident can get once every 3 years. And then if we find an issue with the tank, whether it's the water level's too high or it seems like the drain field's not taking the water, we offer a low interest loan. The resident can get up to $12,000 for up to 36 months. There's just some quick background on the inspections, what the inspection, like the request form fills out. We have it so the homeowner can either be there or not, depending on if they've done it before. We like offering the educational part of it. That way, in case the owner itself have questions, we're there in person and they can ask us, and we can try to help explain what does what. And obviously, these aren't quite as in depth as a point of sale inspection, so they do not qualify for as a point of sale inspection. And then, like I said a minute ago, water bill credit's $150 once every 3 years. Just kind of get them within a 90-day turnaround period from them pumping it out.
And Connor, can I ask, does that pay
Yeah.
for it? Is that enough these days?
I mean, roughly. I mean, I've seen $410, so it gives you about right at half.
Gotcha. Pays for part of it.
Yeah, pays for part of it at least. I mean, better than nothing. And then we have the water bill. Just kind of make sure you're all paid up on your town bills, water taxes. Just need to quote the permit from Dare County, and then we can do the payment schedule and get up to 36 months to pay it back. Some things we're working on now is kind of some more educational. We've had some issues brought recently of people parking on drain fields during the summertime, especially with some of they're being in rental houses, and we're trying to come up with ideas of getting out what damage can be done to systems with people parking on them or driving over them when they're down visiting. And it's kind of just, we're talking about having, more posts and ropes around the drain fields, putting up signs, kind of having it in the rental agreements, no parking in this grass area, kind of. So I was just reading the question that just came through. Unfortunately, we are the only town in Dare County that has a program like this.
Yeah, and I think the town of Nags Head is really a leader for North Carolina in much of this too.
I mean, so it started in '99. They did the first DWMP in 2005. They just updated the plan April of last year. Everything took effect of July of 2022, and then we're slowly making progress on the recommended updates. So that's kind of where we're at so far with them. We did, yeah. So we're getting there. And then we did, instead of doing the voluntary subscription service, we made the Septic Health Committee to kind of work on what the program already offers and boost up what we already do before trying to take on a whole new big aspect of the program. There's everybody's on it, and that's it.
Okay, thanks so much, Connor. Glad you all are doing what you do. I'm going to turn it over to Leslie Linhard with the South Carolina Environmental Law Project. Let me see if I can share these slides. One moment.
Jane, I can do it.
Oh yeah, you want to try?
I don't mind. It's just easier for me to go ahead.
Yeah, please
Do it. Hold on. Moment. Okay. Beginning. Okay. I was not aware of the work that Nags Head has done. That's they can certainly teach a lot of municipalities in South Carolina some things about septic tanks, because one of the things I just wanted to touch on today is the litigation avenues that we're trying to walk through. And the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control is really very problematic in their lack of oversight, and enforcement and all the things with DHEC. So we really are also trying to focus on local government and trying to encourage them to take control of it. But you know, we've everyone here has talked about the problem with septic, but it's certainly specifically in South Carolina is the oversight of DHEC and the failure of them to, you know, retain records, require any real maintenance, inspections, those kinds of things. And, you know, this is not just specific to South Carolina, but the high density developments that we're seeing along our coast are creating these major problems and are manifesting all of the problems that we've talked about today. I know some of this is already y'all are familiar with, but especially DHEC, between 10 and 30% of septics in South Carolina are failing to work properly. And so, you know, all of the negative impacts that we've already discussed. And so what we've been trying to do is focus in on, again, lack of management, transparency, and accountability on the state government. These are just some of the bullet points of the things that we don't see. And one of the things that is also problematic in our state is that septic tanks under 1,500 gallons a day are not placed on public notice. So if you see, or if you become aware of, you know, a development, they could have already gone and gotten their septic tanks. And in South Carolina, to challenge a particular permit, you have 15 days from the date the permit's issued to get your challenge in. So if it's not on public notice, then you don't have any way to know if it's been applied for or even issued. And then once you find out, often you're outside the window. So that's one of the things we're trying to fix. The other thing that is a problem is that we have our Coastal Zone Management Act requires DHEC to certify all state and federal permits in the 8 coastal counties that they are consistent with the policies of the coastal management program. And those kind of policies just take into account the specific and unique aspects of our coast, not only in the critical areas, beaches and tidelands, but vulnerable areas that are subject to the sea level rise and climate change issues we've already talked about. And despite the statutory requirement, DHEC has not certified or reviewed septic tanks for consistency. One of the policies that's particularly important is that in the program is to evaluate cumulative impacts to these kinds of developments. That's not happening for these individual septic tank permits. So what you have is you have a development that's very high density with hundreds of septic tanks proposed for that site that are close to a resource, for example, Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, and DHEC will not look at it as a whole. They will just take it one by one, and you meet the setback, and you meet those calculations of the depth and the soils, and you get the permit. And so no consideration of the dangers of having septic tanks piled on one another is taken into account. So last year we filed an action in state circuit court for a declaratory judgment, and the Coastal Conservation League and the Charleston Waterkeeper were our plaintiffs. We represented them, asking a judge to declare that DHEC, number one, must place these permits on public notice so that there can be community involvement and input and due process for these. And then the other issue is the lack of coastal zone consistency certification. So we want a declaration that DHEC's responsibility is to do that. Subsequent to the filing of the complaint, we asked for a preliminary injunction to prevent DHEC from issuing permits, not all septic tanks, but those which are within 200 feet of a water of the United States, which would be a wetland a water of the state, sorry, wetland, water body, lake, ocean, beachfront, any of those issues, or if it's part of a larger common plan of development, which would be, a lot of these high density. If we're not talking about, you've got a family plot that, that wants a single septic tank, is in a rural area, that's not what we're worried about necessarily. But these are the high density things. And we thank Jane very much. She provided a very extensive affidavit in support of our motion and provided the court with a lot of really valuable information about the dangers of having these septic tanks. It's been very frustrating because the judge heard our motion in September and still has not ruled as to whether or not this injunction's in place until the case is actually heard on the merits. So we're still waiting for that, but the kind of developments we're seeing down here are really extreme. We have a development in Berkeley County where there are 800 lots proposed, some within less than a third of an acre in size, all on septic tanks, all out of a sewer service area, all in Charleston County, northern Charleston County, over 200 lots, all with septic tanks. And again, that one was about a mile from the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. I could go on and on. I mean, Johns Island, there's just an inundation of high density development, which I'm sure is also, prevalent in North Carolina. So that's kind of why we're focused on the state and trying to get DHEC to do its job. We have a couple other ones, that I'll just touch on very briefly because I know we're short on time. We have had 2 cases where we became aware of a septic tank permit that was issued by DHEC, and did our best to find out, submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, and they failed to comply with the provisions of the act. Asked them on multiple occasions, no public notice, so we had no way of ensuring that we knew about it. And these permits get issued, and we find out a month later. And those cases, those administrative appeals go to the administrative law court, which is a different, it's not actually a judicial body, it's actually part of the executive branch. And both cases we are handling were kicked out of court for being untimely. And really, how are we there is no mechanism for a member of the public or a homeowners association or any other group to take advantage of a right to challenge these permits. So it's really very, very much a lack of transparency. And this one that I just mentioned is in Spartanburg County, but this, and it was dismissed, but Bay Point Island, which is one of our barrier islands, undeveloped barrier islands in Beaufort County, has individual lots platted. And the problems with citing these on a barrier island, sandy soils, the last sort of defense with storm surge and all those things is a terrible problem. And we have no way at this point to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're still appealing those. Those are active. So, it's an uphill battle. The administrative law judges are very conservative. A lot of our state court judges are very conservative, but we're trying to trying to get there. So that's just my the things I wanted to mention. And certainly if anybody has any more interest, I can certainly, share those filings.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I want to know, I think there was a question about, some of the rules in North Carolina. Things are quite different from state to state. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality is really our state agency in charge of some of these types of regulations, and it is quite different. So we don't have time to get into that. I really appreciate that you all were here. I'll just call this a teaser because this topic is complex, and I think you could please reach out to any of us if you have additional questions. I did put in the chat all of our research results. There is a nice web page that describes those with several different reports that you can also check out. And I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca.
Thanks, Jane. And thank you to all of our panelists today for just a really fascinating overview. And I learned a lot. Thank you for your time. Just wanted to share for everyone that this was the last webinar in our fall series on climate health and equity. We are already looking at topics for the spring. So do stay tuned for future webinars from C3HE. You can view all of the recorded webinars from our website, carolinascap.com. As soon as today's webinar is uploaded to our YouTube channel, it will be available from there as well. And if you have questions or suggested topics for future webinars that you'd like to learn more about, please do reach out. And I think with that, we will end things for today. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Take care.